So now we're going to start. I'm going to turn the recording thing. And now that we've heard this morning from a number of people who've told us about the lot and the suffering of children around the world, and how reaching out to them also reaches into cultures, Monsignor Stephen Rossetti of the Catholic University of America is going to share with us a history of abuse in the Catholic Church. I've been part of events with Monsignor Rossetti. I consider him a friend of Spirit, Fire, and of mine. And I've seen this presentation, and I think and I hope everyone really gets as much out of it as I have. So take it away, Monsignor Rossetti. Over to you.
Thank you, Teresa, and I certainly consider you a friend too, and I love the work of Spirit, Fire, and strongly support it, which is why I'm here today to support your work and your important ministry, and one that's not easy. I think we should not underestimate the cost for you and all your friends who have helped so much. It's not easy. It's not easy. So I
thank you very much.
Recognize that. Yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk about how we got to where we are and the mistakes and some of the mistakes and some of the things we've learned, which is important, and not only for us to own our history, but to point a way forward, not just for this country, but I think a learning for other countries too. So I think one of the questions people ask me is, why now? Why all of a sudden does it seem like there's so much abuse going on? Some people saying, well, is there more now? Why didn't we hear about this when I was growing up? We never heard about such things. So the question is, why now? Well, the first thing to say is, it's not new. People have somewhat known about the sexual abuse of minors for a long time. Here's this canon from the Council of Elvira in Spain. So the bishops of Spain got together in around 309, 310 AD. That's 1700 years ago. And they wrote a law, a canon, a church law, against abusing minors. They said, men who sexually abuse boys shall not receive communion, not even at the end. So we knew about this 1700 years ago and wrote a law against it. There was so much abuse of boys going on in Spain that they wrote a law against it. So the question comes is, if we knew about this, the church and society, because the church is part of society, what did we do for the next 1700 years, or maybe 1650 years, to keep minors safe and to really address this issue? And the answer is nothing. Essentially nothing. That society and church both pretty much ignored it for a variety of reasons. And I'll go through. So the question is, why now? Why is it right in front of us today? Well, first of all, the number one, there are four reasons, I think. First of all, the 20th century has been dubbed the century of the child. In the early 1900s, there was a lot, or in late 1800s, there's a lot of exploitation of minors. They were working in coal mines. They were prostituted. All sorts of things were terrible abuse of children. But people didn't, before that, care. They said, well, children are property and we can do what we like. Whereas beginning in the early 1900s, people started to say, no, children are people. And they have all the rights that any human person has, including not to be abused and to be exploited. And so that in the early 1900s, we see the rise of child labor laws, child protection laws, and the beginning of the saying we need to protect children. So the first thing is the recognition that children have rights. Now, one of the reasons why this is important is because much of the work of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors right now in Rome is in those areas of the world that don't recognize this. They don't recognize that children have an innate dignity and their rights need to be protected. So sometimes they'll go to a country and they'll say, you need to stop this exploitation and abuse of minors. And sometimes it's met with quite a bit of pushback. They say, why bother? I mean, we can do what we like with children. So sometimes this bringing the issue of the protection of minors in some parts of the world starts very basically. Do you recognize and realize that children are full human beings and have rights? Number one. Number two, When I was growing up in the 50s, we didn't talk about sex. I mean, my total sexual sort of preparation from my family was my dad threw a little book at me and says, well, you know about this stuff. And we didn't talk about those things. And when you watch television programs, for example, like Ozzie and Harriet or things like that, they never talked about sex or these sorts of things. So, and not just about sexuality in general, of course, definitely not about child abuse or sexual abuse. So that would be something that would never have been mentioned publicly. It was just verboten. And so starting around with the sexual revolution of the 60s, people started to say that sexuality was a subject that should be discussed. Now, I don't say that the sexual revolution of the 60s is all good. There were some bad parts of it to it. But at least now, people could say, we could talk about this. And one of the things they could talk about was the fact that children were being sexually abused and exploited.
Can I interrupt and ask this? Sure. We were going to have a casually formal, informal kind of conversations. That was your term. But when people talk about this, they sometimes think because the world became more sexual and is in the revolution, that then that permitted children to be abused sexually more often. When in fact, I think you're hearing, and what you're saying is, it just let people admit stuff was going on and talk. And by just being able to talk, they were able to recognize what was already going on anyway.
Fundamentally, yes, I would say child sexual abuse has been going on forever. So It's not new. But the question comes is, was there a blip up in the 70s and 80s? Okay. The John Jay study suggests that there was. And some of the statistics from David Finkelhor at the University of New Hampshire and places like that suggest there was a blip up in abuse, both in society as well as in the church. And that's when the issue of, was there a rise in abuse in the 70s and 80s? I think actually it was. But fundamentally, abuse has always been taking place.
Okay, good.
I think both of those statements are true.
Yeah.
Number 3, also an awareness of the trauma caused by abuse. Even recently in the church history, people said, well, they'll get over it. Children won't remember. Don't make a big fuss about it. It's not a problem. Just don't. As a matter of fact, in that famous Kinsey study of sexuality in 1953, which was considered to be kind of avant-garde at the time. Kinsey wrote that, here's what he said in the report. You can just find it yourself. It is difficult to understand why a child, except for its cultural conditioning, should be disturbed at having his genitalia touched, or disturbed at seeing the genitalia of other persons, or disturbed in even more specific sexual context. So Kinsey said, we don't understand why people say children should be disturbed by this. And they said that if children are traumatized, it's because the police and the parents and people around them are overreacting. And so they're traumatizing the kids. So even as late as, there are even several studies around 40s and 50s by clinical journals saying that the whole thing's overblown, it's not a problem.
It also brings up, and this is something you and I are on the same side of anyway, and almost the basis of our friendship, where that's why it's really important survivors do talk about this and find ways to express what it was for us, as opposed to just not being studied alone, just to be able to be heard. And we didn't, right, why talk about it? Because if you talk about it, you start acknowledging how bad it was.
Yeah, I think that was really what the watershed was. How did we understand that this was traumatic? We listened to those who've been victimized. That's what changes hearts when people hear the pain of the victims. That's why, if I had one wish that would change hearts, it's listen to those who've been abused. The studies are great, all these workshops are great, but fundamentally, I say again and again, listen to those who've been victimized. That's what connects with people, and that's what changed the church, as I'll talk about in a moment.
But I also want to just add, and then I'll let you go on. This is a little advertisement for the purpose of the whole conference. No. Listen to the survivors, but don't rewound them, because now there's a little fashion about, let's go find our survivor and talk to them. If they talk to you, they're not going to be rewounded because you understand how to talk to us about topics. Right. But even the good-natured Catholics who are trying to integrate survivors into the dialogue, it's really a good idea to get a little bit of basics about how to deal with anybody who's been traumatized.
Yeah, no, well said. It's important for us to not re-traumatize. And frankly, I think there's been a lot of re-traumatization in the public, unfortunately.
Right.
And one of the messages given to those who've been victimized today, which is wrong, is that if you've been sexually victimized as a minor, you're doomed for life.
Right.
And it's not true. But it's serious. We need to take it seriously. But don't make them feel like they're damaged goods.
Right. And here's the interesting thing. And then if you say that wearing the collar, a lot of people think it's self-serving because the church is saying it's not that bad. But the fact is, you're saying, and this is why I'd be comfortable having any survivor I know talk to you, right, is you know it's bad. You know how bad it is. You feel that, but also you can talk about hope, which is what people find with our Lord and other places. But for me, it's the practice of spirituality and faith. And then now I'll turn it over to talking about the impact of child abuse. But it's really important for people to know that it's not self-serving when you say there's hope.
Well, I should say I'm also a licensed psychologist and have spent 30 years working with those who've been victimized and those who perpetrated as well.
Right.
And you start with a recognition of the pain, though. I think you start with that. Don't start with the you'll be fine. No. You start with the recognition of the pain and then say, but there is hope. Right. There is hope.
Right.
Because we recognize the innate strength and health of all human beings. Right. Fundamentally, in all of us, there is this striving for healing, this resilience in people, and we need to tap into that.
Right.
So this is just what David Finkelhor, and just a wonderful researcher who I use so much, gave us 4 types of trauma associated with abuse. And I won't go through all specifically, but just to give you an idea again of how pervasive the trauma can indeed be for many of those who've been victimized. They feel betrayed. Their sexuality can be traumatized. I mean, how many stories do we hear about women, for example, having problems in their marital relationships because of the early abuse? Stigmatization, sometimes people, and the rise of suicide sadly, among those who've been victimized. We can't, and substance abuse. And then a sense of powerlessness, which again, very important, that the victims were abused as a minor and sometimes can be stuck in that feeling of being a child. And so to say, no, you were abused as a minor, but now you are an adult and you can say no, and you can be an adult human being and establish your own boundaries.
Yes. So, and the great part about this list is it's really important from a scientific point of view for people to understand it, but to go inside is to any one of these issues from a survivor point of view. Self-mutilization for the people I know who cut, sometimes it's less painful to cut than it is to feel the feelings of the memories. And while I beg every survivor not to do that and to come find help, it's important that people seeing this list from you knows on the other side are people who can describe it in very real terms of a life experience too. And I really appreciate the way you put it up here, but are very, very sensitive to what it means to the people who live it.
Yeah, thanks. And fourth and finally, in other words, why now? Why is this issue surfacing so prominently now? Fourth is to realize how widespread sexual abuse was. Some people say, well, okay, there was some abuse, but it's pretty rare. They figure it's pretty rare and doesn't happen much. And the problem is we find out that, in fact, it's not rare. And that's shocking. And people still don't believe it. It's just the same result with the Me Too generation, Me Too movement. People say, well, okay, this happened to this one person, but it doesn't happen so much. That when Pope Benedict was asked, it's in his book, A Light of the World, why he was not more aggressive in dealing with the problem of abuse when he was the Archbishop of Munich. He answered, for me, it was a surprise that abuse also existed on that scale in Germany. I mean, he said, I didn't know. Well, maybe should have known, but nonetheless, people don't know. And they say, well, okay, it's a rare thing. I did my own study, by the way, of active Catholics in the pews about 10 years ago. And it turns out that about a little over 19% said they'd been sexually abused as a minor, males and females together, which is by 1 out of 5. which is males and females together. That's right in the national average, more or less. It's about 1 of every 3 or 4 women, 1 out of 6 to 8 males, more or less, depending on how you define it, have been sexually accosted in some way as a minor, and that's a lot. You have to call it an epidemic. I mean, if that many people are being abused. So, what did we learn? That abuse is widespread. It is traumatic. That children have rights, and that we need to protect them. So we need to develop a culture of safeguarding. We have to change our entire culture. So some of the mistakes that we as church have made, but many organizations, as a matter of fact, frankly, if you look at institutions in general, you'll find out that most institutions make these kinds of mistakes. The first one, as we already mentioned, underestimating the prevalence and the harm it causes. That this is a constant. And for example, frankly, in the Holy See, at the beginning they used to say, well, this is an American problem. I mean, I heard that we don't have that here. Yeah. And then when it spread to Ireland and England, places like that, say, well, this is an English-speaking problem, or a Western problem. We don't have that here. But then it started surfacing in Poland, Austria, Germany, Latin American countries, and people say, well, okay, this doesn't happen over here. Then we find out it's happening in Asia and African nations, and it's ubiquitous around the world. And I still get a lot of pushback on this when I go to other countries and they say, well, you're talking about American problems. I say, well, I don't think so.
Yeah. It also tells you that when people start talking about it, then it gets acknowledged. But when people still aren't talking about it, it's hard to even come to grips with.
Yeah, the first few courageous people to break the silence are critical, because then other people can come along and say, okay, yeah, that happened to me too. Now, there are several unique aspects. A lot of the things that churches experience are experienced by other organizations as well, but there are some unique problems that we as church have around these issues. One is what I call a kind of celibate tone deafness. And that is that, we don't have kids. Frankly, and we're nice to children, hopefully, but we don't have our own children, and so the church tends to deal with the abuse of minors as like, it's okay, one more problem. You got this problem, you got that problem, you got that problem. The abuse of minors got this problem, that problem, and it's just one more problem. Okay, we'll deal with it. But actually, that's not how people in society feel about it, because we don't recognize sometimes how parents feel and families feel when their youngest and most vulnerable are abused. They are outraged. It is not like this is a unique situation that people will not tolerate and are outraged about. I try to say, when I give these workshops to priests and religious, I say, look, I want you to imagine that your beloved nephew was sexually abused by a priest. How would you feel about that? What would you want to have happen? They say, oh my gosh, I'd be outraged. I said, I would want that person thrown out of priesthood. I would want him sent to jail, and I would want him, the bishop, to apologize and to deal with my nephew with great kindness and compassion and healing. I say, well, that's exactly what the people want. Somehow we have to understand the righteous anger and really raging emotions around this issue. Child abuse is awful, and when you think about this, what it does to a society, you're harming your future. You're harming the most vulnerable among you, and so we should. And I think that's one of the mistakes the church keeps making, and still does make. Bishops don't get angry enough about it. They do that kind of nice thing. Bishops are supposed to be nice. That's fine. We want our bishops to be nice. They sit and smile, and they're nice, and they smile. Fine. But not when it comes to this issue. Stop smiling and get angry. Right. You stop smiling and get angry about this, because you should be.
Yeah. Well, and also, in another day, everyone will spend a day with us studying and looking at how whole families are wounded too. So it's the family gets mad about what happens to the child if they even know, but the family walks around tottering with their own wounds as a result. So bishops are really saving families as well as individuals too.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes the trauma to family members can be as bad, sometimes even worse, and unconsolable.
Yes.
You know, unconsolable.
That's right.
So, as you mentioned, Teresa, very well, that one of the real beginning steps is listening to victims. And by the way, that was something that changed the course of the church in the United States in 2002 in Dallas. Mm-hmm. In Dallas, when all the bishops were gathered for their June meeting, 4 survivors stood up and told their story, and it was heartrending. And it was right after that they passed the Dallas Charter within hours. When finally the bishops were forced to listen to the pain of victims, and I got to hand it to them to listen. And
since then, what's little known, but survivors who've done this know, a lot of bishops, not all, but some bishops have been very pastoral and met with survivors and listened and shared the trauma and walked away with the cross too. Nobody can take away the pain, but the fact is that there are bishops who've tried to listen and who walk away with a piece of that trauma in them too.
Yeah, and I must say, Bishop Harry Flynn was one of the first bishops to start that down in Louisiana after the Gilbert Gout case. They sent Bishop Flynn down there, and he actually began that process of bishops publicly being willing to listen to victims.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's important. And so we as church need to learn how to do active, empathetic, non-judgmental listening. Sometimes we're not very good at that. Those kind of healing listening skills.
Yeah. How about not, and one of my favorite ones is, don't solve our problem because we're not a problem. Listen to us as people. And it's I know I've learned to just accept it, that that's an impulse that's good. It comes from a good place, but it's also somebody who hasn't realized how powerful it is just to be a human with another person in this setting.
Yeah, and that connects with this one about re-empowering victims. Don't fix me. We want to empower those who've been victimized.
Right.
And little ways can be helpful. For example, you say, well, if you've been victimized, come on and we'll meet in the chancery. Can you imagine what it's like for some of the victimized to walk through those doors of the chancery? Let them choose where you're going to meet.
Right.
Or for example, we're going to pay for your therapy. Fine. You will see this person as a therapist. Well, maybe, but it re-empowers those victimized. Say, okay, you pick your therapist.
Yeah.
We let you choose. Re-empowering those who've been victimized so important. Now, it's in the structure of the church. It's so. For example, when an allegation, the bishop sits down.
Can you hold on? We're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to cut there for a minute, and then let's start again where you were just after you said let people choose their therapy, and try again because we lost your whole feed.
Okay, yeah, my thing said let me move. I better not move though. Now that you've got my same background. Yeah.
No, it's okay. We don't care. I'm like, don't worry. You want to change your background? No problem.
Well, no, I was going to move the room next door, but that's okay because all of a sudden it'll be crazy for.
Okay.
Okay. So where do you want me to start?
You can start right there. That's good.
Okay, so another major mistake which the church has made, and it's built into the very structure of the church, is focusing on and being manipulated by offenders. When an allegation surfaces, the bishop sits down with the vicar for clergy or the chancellor or whatever, and they call on the priest who has been accused, and they listen to him, and he usually was to give you some sort of, I didn't do it, my actions were exaggerated or misinterpreted, some sort of denial, rationalization, and then the bishop says, okay, we'll just stop that and whatever, but. So they pay attention to the priest because he's part of the structure of the organization. Whereas those who've been victimized, they almost never got in to see the bishop. As one bishop said in Dallas, he said, we forgot that those been victimized are part of our flock too.
Right.
So they gave preference to the priest, which is understandable. He's part of the hierarchy and he's the bishop's special co-worker. So,
Yeah.
but when you do that, you open yourself up to being manipulated by the offenders, and you don't hear the voice of the victims, which is why one of the big changes in Dallas was a victims first policy, not priests first, victims first policy. Now, some of the priests were angry about that, and well, all I can say is too bad, because church has a preferential option for the poor and those who are suffering and those who needed special care. So while we do care about priests, we first have to put the status of the victim first, and I think that's right.
It's a tough topic too, because it's of the priests who are offenders, it really takes them out of the control seat of the narrative alone.
Right.
But for the very few who have been falsely accused, it puts them in a position, and it puts all priests in a position of carrying an extra burden of charity. Yep. And it's a lot to ask, because as a survivor, to find justice, I don't want to have more injustice. I don't want to have other people suffer, but it's a reality. And I think that it's good for Catholics to process that reality too. Yeah. Even though you can't have your offender in the first seat telling the story the first time.
Yeah, no, it is a delicate balance of protecting the rights of all human beings, including those who've been accused, but still giving those who've been victimized front and center. And this Cardinal Super said this, in this quote here: if we always put the child at the center of the conversation, then we can't go wrong. Now, this might sound obvious, but and many times it's not, because when you're trying to deal with allegations or problems like this, or situations that arise, there are many competing interests. You got the media comes at you, the legal people come at you, the canon lawyers talk to you, the priests come at you, those who've been victimized come at you, and there's all these different competing. So how do I deal with this? And then many times there are competing interests and competing rights, actually. So the question comes is, how can we deal with this best? What's the Lord calling us to? And I think this statement by Cardinal Supich is right, that if you say to yourself, okay, what's our first goal? We have many goals. What's our first goal? Our first goal is keeping children safe. Right. So everything we do around this issue should be designed for keeping children safe.
You know what's beautiful about that too is it rights a wrong that didn't happen when I was abused, because nobody kept me safe. But it rights the wrong now. It even goes into the past and rights the wrong in some levels of what happened to me. I'm not saying anything ever really will, but it's a real comfort to know that the child's safety that we're unified around the child's safety. That's a big deal.
Right. So when someone comes forward and says they've been victimized, you say, oh my gosh, how can we keep this person safe starting today? And how can we keep other children safe in the ambit of this these relationships? Right. So one of the most common errors made by individuals working with perpetrators is being conned by the denial, manipulation of the client. And you know, as a psychologist who has worked with for 25 years with those who are not only victimized but some perpetrators, is that it's very easy to be conned by the denial of the perpetrators, and they're very good at it because they spent years conning themselves. These are the rationalizations that they talk themselves into. It wasn't sex; it was education. The child was coming on to me. All these sorts of rationalizations. I had too much to drink. So I don't know what I did. So one of the things that we implemented in the program I worked at was when we were analyzing, we were sort of clinically looking at allegations of perpetration. We had 3 psychologists work with everyone. So one might get conned, but not all 3. Which is very helpful. And here's some of the typical distortions you hear from child molesters.
I just have to interject, though. That's actually when I heard you say that at your first speech, I knew that I would like you. This is before we knew each other. Because from being a survivor, as a child, you watch the con game every day.
Mm.
It's devastating because you wonder who will ever believe me, because you see how strong the belief system is around. And when I realized that there were 3 people, it meant that meant they knew that they could be conned. And that was a really great moment for me.
Very difficult. I mean, it was not uncommon that one of the psychologists would say, well, you know, the other 2 said nonsense. That's just a bunch of manipulation, you know, and it wasn't sex. We were just wrestling.
Yeah.
I remember years ago, an archbishop from a place that will remain nameless called me up, and a priest was accused of being improper, you know, with adolescent boys, and the bishop said, hey, he was just wrestling with the boys, and he said, I don't see what's wrong with that. So here was this parish priest wrestling with 14, 15, 16-year-old boys. I said, well, bishop's inappropriate. He shouldn't be doing that. And he said, so when he evaluated the man, it turned out he was sexually attracted to 15-year-old boys. So the bishop still didn't understand why it was a problem. And I was sort of racking my brain to try to help this archbishop understand it. And finally I said, Bishop, I want you to imagine, I'm assuming you're heterosexual, I want you to imagine you wrestling with a beautiful woman. He got it. He got it, yeah. It's not athletic, it's a foreplay. I mean, but he didn't, it's hard to understand because of the cons of the perpetrators.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So now another step implemented by Dallas was mandatory reporting. I say mostly, because I think all cases should be reported. Now, some states don't require old ones to be reported, but nonetheless, they all should be reported. I think there is still a bit of I'm not sure everything is being reported, and this is something I'm concerned about in the church today.
Yeah.
Every allegation should be reported, and most of them are. But nonetheless, I would say this to people. They say, well, this will take care of the problem. And the answer is no, it won't. And one of the reasons why is that very few allegations are prosecuted by civil authorities. And that's something that people don't understand. So they say, well, if you just reported these to the civil authorities, they would have taken care of it. You don't realize how difficult it is to investigate these and adjudicate. And also not to mention the statute of limitation problems in criminal law.
Right.
So the fact is that very, very few allegations are actually prosecuted, sadly. And I think
let me just pitch in there. Yes, that's true about the church, but it's also true about society at large, and the concern for children in the world, not just in the church, really behooves looking at that. Even mandatory reporting from state to state can vary just a little bit on the fine points, but unfortunately, the differentials are some children that don't go protected. So what you're saying is really important for the church, but it's also to remember it's just not about the church.
Right, right. And my personal opinion, I would like to see the statute of limitations lifted for the criminal prosecution. I know there are problems with that.
Yeah.
But I would like to see it lifted. And I would like to see the states put a lot more money into people to investigate and adjudicate these cases.
Yeah, it would be really nice to know that all of the abusers were on the sex offenders list. I know there's a lot of argument about what gets posted on a website for a diocese, but I just want people to know who's alive and out there who has already been proven to hurt children. I don't even care how it's done, but no, I appreciate what you're saying there.
Yeah. Now, so what we've done in the church in the U.S., which I think is important, is to say, look, church leaders who are trained in theology, 4 years of theology, are not good investigators and adjudicators of child abuse. That's not our specialty. So we should have professionals who know this work to help us. So that's why we have these diocesan review boards. That the diocesan review boards should be and are filled with professionals, former FBI agents and criminal investigators, psychiatrists, psychologists, child workers, all these kinds of people who know how to deal with these issues professionally and can advise the bishop. Frankly, I think this is the way to go. I think it's helped the country because bishops have no business adjudicating these things by something that they don't know. They don't know. So when civil authorities don't adjudicate them, they go back to the diocese. And then you've got a bishop and the chancellor trying to figure it out. And that, no.
Yeah.
You need some professionals to help you. And by the way, I would suggest to the Holy See to do this. The Holy See does not have its own lay review board. They need a lay review board. No, they've got still a bunch of people like a bunch of monsignors, you know, who are dealing with these cases. And while they're fine canonically, they really need experts. They do have some experts who advise them occasionally, but you've seen a number of cases like the Chile cases and others where they blew it. And one of the reasons they blew it was they were not advised well. And so then they call in Archbishop Scicluna, who's a total mensch on these issues, and he figures it out. But they need their own review board, and the Holy See doesn't have one. They occasionally use experts, but they need a standing review board. Now, another problem has been, third problem, is that believing that perpetrators could be cured and risk-free. You want to save their vocations. Well, there's been a lot of sort of, and now, of course, as someone who worked in a clinical treatment program, I understand the issue. The fact is that psychology never cures anything. That's a medical term. If someone comes in who's depressed and they come into our program and we treat them and they walk out not depressed, we would say, successful case. Will the person ever be depressed again? Maybe. So we can successfully treat people, but it doesn't mean they'll never have that problem again. Same thing with those who molest minors. Can we successfully treat many? Yes, and we have. Does that mean none of them will ever reoffend? No, some may and some will. I remember at the Dallas meeting in 2002, a bishop came up to me and said, "Steve, if you can promise me that this guy will never abuse a minor 100%, never do it again, I'll put him back in ministry." And I said, well, we don't do anything 100%. I mean, if we have a 95% cure rate, we're smashingly successful. But that's 5% that will reoffend. Right. Now, one of the mistakes made today is that people think that all abusers are definitely going to reoffend. Not true. But some of them will. And so we have an idea who might, but we're not always sure. For example, look at this, these stats by Carl Hansen from Canada, one of the great researchers in Canada. And you see the recidivism rate there, 13% after 5 years, 18% for 10 years, 23% after 15 years. So 1 out of 4 in their study would reoffend, which again is a lot, but it's not 100%. In St. Luke's, for example, the relapse rate for offenders of priest offenders was 6.2%. Now, there will be more that you don't know about, but again, contrary to popular opinion, priest offenders tend to make good clients. Actually, they tend to be have more social supports. They tend to be higher functioning, less clinical pathology, so they tend to do better. But it's not 100%. You know, it's.
Can you reduce the recidivism rate? So, for example, if that person is monitored, like they are in some of the religious orders, or even, I don't know, continued therapy as an example, is there a way to reduce the rate of in any way? Definitely.
David Finkelhorst's studies show that relapse rates are reduced by 1/3 for those who molested minors if they go through treatment.
Really?
Yeah. So and the reality is, yes. So we put them through treatment. I would say maybe a certain amount of them will do great in treatment and not reoffend. Some of them will get better in treatment, and then there will be a group that won't. Now, but if you treat them, put them in a work which is not directly connected with minors, and supervise them, our experience has been that very few of them, if frankly, if any, will reoffend. But you have to supervise them, put them in a work which is not connected to minors, and put them through treatment in the beginning and then ongoing treatment. The relapse rate's very low. And that was the approach we took in the 90s, which has been sort of vilified. But I would say that actually, if you look at the numbers, it largely worked, but not 100%. And what we've gone to now is we throw them all out with zero tolerance, which I understand, and I support it, because pastorally speaking, the church can't afford any risk. Can't afford any risk. You abuse a minor in the United States of America, you are out of ministry. The problem with is then they leave our environments, right, and they're not supervised and generally not treated these days.
And that's rather haunting from a point of view from a survivor, because it means that somebody's just out there hurting when I wish I knew where they were.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that's why I think in the end, not in the next 10 years or 20 years, yeah, or maybe 50 years, but maybe 100 years from now, someone will finally figure out that the best thing we can do to keep children safe. Remember, what's our goal?
Yeah.
Keep children safe. To keep children safe is treat them, supervise them, put them in a healthy work which does not have direct contact with minors, and put them keep an ongoing outpatient therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that works.
Actually, I'm sort of, I'm speaking only for myself, not even for Spirit Fire, but I'm the most comfortable with that model because it means I know where they are too.
Well, right now we're sort of washing our hands of them, many of them,
so thank you. That's good, though. Good.
Yeah. But one of the problems is that it's hard to know always who are the ones who are low risk and who are the ones of very high risk. Chances are, if there's one victim, there are others.
Yeah.
Here's a statistic we ran of 91 priests who perpetrated against minors. You see, the bottom group is they have a few victims. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 victims. Now, one's one too many, but this group tends to do better in treatment. But there are at the top a small group of very dangerous men, and they will not respond well to treatment. These are the Gagans of the world, the Rudy Costas of the world, the Gilbert Goths, all those real high-risk offenders. This one had 500 victims, one had 100, and several of them had scores of victims. So if the church and society has a limited amount of resources, what we really need to do is focus them on identifying these high-risk offenders, because these are the ones who, give it any kind of opportunity, will molest a minor again. Yeah. They're just compulsive and out of control.
Yeah.
And frankly, they should be in jail permanently.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think, or under house arrest somewhere. So, mistake number 4, I think, has been insufficient screening and human formation of our priests, especially around human sexuality. Now, to be fair to the church, people say, well, the church is just starting to implement human screening and formation of its priests in the United States of America. Nonsense. I entered the seminary in 1979, formation 1979. That was what, 41 years ago? A long time ago. 40 years ago. I went through a whole day back in 1979, a whole day of psychological testing. So that was 41 years ago. So we did have it back then. But we didn't do, there was very little available back then to screen and form around human sexuality. So that while we screen them in general, the piece we've added now is really screening them and forming them around human sexuality more directly. And the John Jay study that was because of the Dallas Charter showed that those seminaries that had good human formation programs, they formed their humanity, their sexuality, their emotions, their passions. They had fewer cases of priests or graduates priests abusing minors. So human formation does actually work.
Does it work because it basically drives out the guys that don't fit? Is that what the
Well, I think it's two-pronged approach. Yeah, first it does screen them out. Yeah, screen out the ones, and we do screen out the worst cases. We don't identify them all, but we screen out the worst cases, number 1. And then number 2, when you do help them develop a healthy sense of their emotions and their passions, their sexuality, they can live a chaste celibate life or married life or wherever you go more safely and healthily. those who molest minors almost always mismanage their emotions, mismanage their sexuality, are completely out of touch and say, oh, this wasn't sex. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Or they mismanage their emotions. They start feeling frustrated and anxious and upset, and they start acting out in bad ways. So those dynamics which promote abuse can be rechanneled in more healthy ways.
That's great.
And raising the bar, I think we started to say, look, we can't afford, in society, and the church can't afford, society can't afford police wrestling. We can't afford this anymore. We can't allow this. We have to raise the bar on what we accept. So if you got sexual problems, goodbye. We have to identify those and screen them out, which we're doing better at. Not perfect, but better. Okay, so we are doing better, including criminal background checks, which every seminary is getting. Every time I go to seminary, I say, how many of you who had a criminal background check and been fingerprinted? Everybody raises their hand. When I went to seminary, they didn't fingerprint me. Yeah. Another thing I would say, and this is something newer, I think, and important, is that a mistake we made is missing the red flags. One of the exciting things I think about Dallas in 2002 was the beginning of recognizing the importance of prevention. Let's stop it before it occurs. In 2002, everyone was screaming at hang the perpetrators, fine, but that's not where we should put our real emphasis. Our real emphasis should be on stopping it before it occurs. And you can do that. You can do a lot of it. And one of the things you do is you train leaders on red flags. What are the symptoms of a dysfunctional sexual relationship with minors, or any kind of dysfunctional sexual relationship? And recognize it, raise it, and stop it before it becomes abusive. And I've seen cases where this has happened, and actually some prospective abuse was averted.
It seems like that would also work with vulnerable adults really well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, when you're watching, typically abusers don't just jump out of the bushes and grab a kid. That's another misnomer. That they develop a relationship with a minor, and they start having an inappropriate relationship with a minor. They'll buy them gifts. They'll take them on private outings. They'll be in their apartments by themselves. They're grooming the child. And that's how these things happen. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens just slowly. Same thing with inappropriate relations with adults. There's sort of a grooming process that happens before the abuse actually occurs.
Right.
And some of the red flags, they hang around kids, they hang around the schools, they give them gifts, they friend them in all sorts of social media, they keep secrets with them. And people start feeling, this doesn't feel right to me. They say, there's something wrong with it. Well, listen to that feeling. There's something wrong with it, because there probably is something wrong with it. Yeah. And then it gets really dangerous. They're wrestling with the kids, they have photos with kids, they start touching them inappropriately. They're, hugging and squeezing. They start telling them sexual jokes, giving them alcohol, all sorts of bad things. These are dangerous emergency signs that an intervention is needed immediately. So as I said, I think the most important and appropriate thing that we can do is prevention. Stop abuse before it occurs. And we are getting better. The phrase is, to form a culture of prevention or a culture of child protection. When a whole society changes, is on its toes, it's conversing, it has good relations with its minors, which is alert and implements good boundaries, there's very little chance for abuse to occur. It still can, of course, but it stops a lot of it because you're creating a culture which prevents most abuse. And that's what the church is doing and doing better at. For example, mandatory child protection training. This is part of the Dallas Charter, which I think is so important. If you minister in the church today to minors, and all priests and religious, you will go through some form of child protection training. And since 2017, for example, in the year of 2017, the church in the U.S. spent $34.8 million just on prevention. not legal fees, or just on education and prevention, and 400 million since 2004.
Yeah.
And we've educated over 6 million people, 4 million children and 2 million adults. This is making a difference.
Can I just interpret
Sure.
that on another level too? One of the problems when you or one of the things people don't realize when you create a culture of prevention, when you do this kind of training, it's really more personal formation. So people start getting empowered what to do if they see a sign of abuse. That's a very important aspect of this. Also, people start realizing, wow, I've been giving signals. It's not that they were abusers, but how we behave as adults who don't abuse children matters a lot. So when I encounter a child, I don't immediately go up and hug that child or touch that child. The child doesn't know I'm not doing it, but it's starting to create a world where children don't even get touched in a friendly manner unless they themselves are comfortable. And usually I say, where's your mom or dad? It's an awareness of how we behave, because it makes it uncomfortable for the people who would use that incorrectly to do what they do. I'm not an abuser, but I take part in how I behave to set the model, to make it normative. So I've got we got your whole, you're looking for your last slide?
No, actually, if it jumped out, there we go.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, but this is I just wanted to add that in because it's really, Catholics are being asked to behave differently. Volunteers, everyone is being asked to be part of this.
And it's making a difference. When you look at these graphs, both by Kara and John Jay, this is a John Jay graph, and then there's the Kara graph. You see the abuse peaking in the 70s and early 80s, and then fewer and fewer cases today. Now, you could say, well, that's because there's a delay in reporting, but actually, Kara, which is true, but Kara and John Jay both pointed out that every time there is a new crisis and more cases come forward, they fit the same blip. In other words, there still are some new cases, but not many. And the abuse rate, if it was about 4 to 7%, I think in the 70s or 80s, it's now below 1%. One too many, but we're making progress and reducing cases, and which is one of the most exciting signs and signs of hope, I think. That prevention and creating a culture of abuse, as you just mentioned, does work. Now, I'd like to finish with one idea, and this I have been encouraged by Spirit Fire and its ministry. But first of all, let me say, by the way, that I think that the Church in the United States is not perfect, but it has the most extensive, effective, and expensive child protection program in the world. So I think there's a lot to be said in this, what we're doing. More needs to be done, but I think we're making great progress. But there's especially one thing which I think is so important, and this is the work of Spirit Fire in many ways, and that is that the church needs to be not only a promoter of child safety in the church, but in the society. We need to be on the vanguard of that, but also we need to develop a reconnect with those who've been victimized, that it's not just enough to say, okay, now we're providing healing and prevention. No, the church and society has been wounded and broken relationships, and will never be who we are supposed to be as church until we sit on the same side of the table as those who've been victimized. When they see in the church a friend and someone who is on their side. And we're not there yet. But I would say I applaud the courage of those in Spirit Fire, because that is one of the things that you're trying to do. And I say that is, it's where we need to go to build warm relationships.
It really means a lot, because even some people may never come back in the church. The wound may be too deep. It's their path and their mysterious process of healing. But to feel a friendship and to have an open door, and even if it's not in a church building, but to have Catholics people can come back and talk to who respect what they've gone through, it means the world. And that would be that's really what Luis and I and other survivors at Spirit Fire just are asking. It's just to have the conversation together and not deny that it's still always going to hurt, but that it gets a little better when we're together.
Well, it takes time, and it's not good. It doesn't happen like, I mean, when there's so much hurt and pain and distrust, you can't just say, okay, we'll just have one meeting and it goes away. Right. You know, it's a very slow reconciliation process. But it's important not only for those who've been victimized, but for the church too. And
the gifts are mutual. I mean, I think that I watch survivors give to others incredible gifts from our experience, but the graces that come flooding through when you can somehow, in some way, tiny way, reconnect with your church, it can really help a lot. It doesn't mean you got to start. No one's asking you to completely reconcile and leave it behind. It's just try it out a little bit, be a little closer, and make sure Catholics are helping and not hurting in their good intent, but not forgetting that trauma is a tough thing to wade into, and you need to be prepared to go in well informed.
Yeah. Now, can we end with a prayer? Do you want to say a prayer for us?
You can say the prayer because I got a lot of these sessions and I'll run out of prayers. You can pray over us.
Let's pray for that.
Okay.
Spirit, amen. Let's pray for the success of this conference, success of the ministry of Spirit Fire, for the healing of all those who have been abused, those in church, those who have perpetrated, families especially, of course. All those who have been abused, for God's healing. May we all be reconciled. May we all be brothers and sisters, united in peace. We ask for the power of the Holy Spirit to make this happen, and our open hearts and our willingness to listen. May God bless us today and always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate all you've done for all of us too, all along the way.
It's a joy to see your face, and I mean that sincerely. It's great.
Take care. God bless, and we'll talk soon.
I look forward to it.
Bye-bye.